Welcome back to my YouTube channel, where we dig up the forgotten tales hiding in history's shadows. Today, our journey takes us back to 1850, to the rolling hills of southern Alabama, where the name Ellison was once uttered only in fearful whispers. It was an era of southern prosperity, when cotton was king and fortunes were built upon enslaved labor, and the Ellison family stood among the elite of Alabama society. Their story, passed down through generations, stands as a chilling testament that wealth and status offer no shield against forces that mock all reason. As we explore their history, prepare for a tale that has haunted this region for more than a century and a half, a mystery that remains unsolved to this very hour. Proudly amid acres of cotton fields, stretching toward the horizon, sat the Ellison plantation, a grand two-story mansion with white columns and dark mahogany, all built by the hands of those who served the family's swelling fortune. The locals called it Magnolia Hill, and the house was positioned on the property's highest point. From the wide veranda that wrapped around three sides of the structure, Josiah Ellison could survey his entire domain. Ornate iron gates marked the start of a long drive, lined with ancient oak trees. Their branches formed a natural archway that guided visitors toward the imposing front steps. The family patriarch, Josiah Ellison, had arrived in Alabama in 1825 with nothing but ambition, a modest inheritance from his late father, and 3 enslaved people he had inherited, a man named Moses, his wife Ruth, and their teenage son Samuel. Starting with a mere 50 acres, Josiah worked side by side with the enslaved in those early years. His hands grew as calloused as theirs while he cleared land, planted cotton, and steadily expanded his holdings. He was known for his tireless work ethic and sharp business sense, qualities that earned him respect from his peers, but fear from those he bested in land deals and cotton trades. By 1835, only a decade after his arrival, he had become one of the region's most prosperous cotton planters. His property had grown to over 500 acres, and nearly 40 enslaved people lived and worked there. The simple cabin he'd first built gave way to the magnificent plantation house that now dominated the landscape. Its construction was finished in 1838, perfectly timed with his rising status in Alabama society. Josiah took special pride in the carved wooden staircase that spiraled up through the house's center. Every baluster was handcrafted by a skilled enslaved carpenter he had purchased specifically for that task. In 1830, Josiah married Elizabeth Montgomery, the daughter of a neighboring planter. She was 20 years his junior, a woman of delicate beauty and quiet resolve, with amber eyes that seemed to guard secrets and pale blonde hair ere she wore, in the elaborate styles fashionable for wealthy Southern ladies. Their courtship had been short, arranged largely by Elizabeth's father, who saw in Josiah a rising man whose ambition matched his own. The wedding took place at St. James Episcopal Church in the county seat, attended by the area's most prominent families, and was followed by a 3-day reception at the Montgomery plantation, as was the custom for wealthy families back then. Elizabeth brought a substantial dowry, including 10 enslaved houseworkers skilled in cooking, sewing, and household management. She also brought a collection of family heirlooms dating back to Virginia's early colonial days. The most notable among these was a silver hand mirror, its handle intricately wrought in the shape of intertwined vines, bearing the Montgomery family crest. Elizabeth was seldom seen without this mirror close by, often stopping in her daily activities to stare into its reflective surface with an intensity that unsettled the house servants. The union produced 5 children, 1 son Thomas, born in 1831, and 4 daughters Margaret, born in 1834, Catherine, born in 1836, Josephine, born in 1838, and little Sarah, born in 1844, after a gap that had led many to believe Elizabeth's childbearing years were finished. Each birth was marked by a lavish christening, and as the family grew, so did Josiah's reputation and wealth. By the time Sarah was born, the Ellison name meant prosperity throughout southern Alabama. The Ellisons were respected community members, known for their generosity during hard times and their extravagant gatherings during harvest season. When drought struck the region in 1843, Josiah opened his storehouses to neighboring farmers, offering grain and supplies to those whose crops had failed. During the scarlet fever outbreak of 1845, Elizabeth sent the family physician to attend to afflicted families who couldn't afford medical care, an act of charity that saved many lives. These gestures earned the Ellisons the community's gratitude, though some whispered their generosity was simply a way to assert their superior status. Their seasonal balls were legendary, drawing guests from as far away as Mobile and Montgomery. The Christmas Ball of 1846 was especially memorable, with the plantation house decorated with fresh pine boughs and red velvet ribbons. Silver candelabras cast a warm glow over the assembled guests in their finest attire. The banquet table groaned under roast turkey, glazed ham, oyster dressing, sweet potato pies, and syllabub, all prepared by the skilled hands of Ruth, now the head cook, who had been with the family since Josiah's arrival in Alabama. Every Sunday, they attended service at St. James Episcopal Church, arriving in a polished carriage drawn by 4 matched bay horses, the family dressed in their finest. Josiah served as a vestryman, giving generously to the church's building fund and missionary efforts. Elizabeth taught Sunday school to the children of other planter families, her gentle manner and firm moral guidance making her a favorite among her young charges. The family occupied the first pew, their presence a weekly reminder of their standing in the community. After services, they often hosted Sunday dinner for the minister and select parishioners, discussing theology and local affairs over Elizabeth's famous peach cobbler. On the surface, they embodied the prosperity and gentility of the antebellum South. A family blessed by God and fortune, untouched by hardship or sorrow. Their enslaved people were well, fed and clothed by the standards of the time, their fields productive, their future secure in a society that valued lineage and land above all else. But beneath this veneer of Southern respectability, a darkness was brewing. A darkness that would consume the family over the course of a decade, leaving behind a legacy of fear and superstition that persists to this day. Some said it began with the purchase of the land itself, a transaction the old-timers in the county had advised against. Others pointed to Elizabeth's peculiar habits. Her interest in books proper Southern ladies weren't supposed to read. Her midnight wanderings on the plantation grounds. A few brave souls whispered about the old oak tree at the property's edge. A massive, ancient thing that had stood there long before the Ellisons arrived, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like arms raised in supplication. The enslaved people had their own theories, shared in whispers late at night in their quarters. Bessie, Elizabeth's personal maid, claimed she had seen her mistress speaking to empty air beneath that oak tree on moonlit nights, uttering words in a language Bessie had never heard. Moses, now elderly but still responsible for the gardens, swore that flowers planted near the tree grew in unnatural ways, their blooms larger and more vibrant than seemed possible, yet giving off a sickly sweet scent that caused headaches and strange dreams. Young Samuel, now grown and serving as Thomas Ellison's valet, once reported seeing pale figures moving among the branches, though he was soundly whipped for spreading such superstitious nonsense. But if the family was aware of these whispers, they gave no indication. Life at Magnolia Hill continued in its orderly rhythm. The days marked by the seasons and the work of the plantation the social calendar of balls and dinners, the milestones of the children's growth and education. Until that summer of 1845, when everything began to change. Our story truly begins in the summer of 1845, when Margaret Ellison, the eldest daughter, was preparing for her 16th birthday. In antebellum Southern society, a young lady's 16th year marked her transition from childhood to womanhood, the time when she would be formally presented to society and begin the process of finding a suitable husband. For the daughter of a wealthy planter, like Josiah Ellison, this was a milestone of tremendous importance, one that would be celebrated with a lavish coming-out ball and the commissioning of a portrait to commemorate the occasion. Margaret was a spirited young woman with chestnut hair that fell in natural waves to her waist, and her father's determined gray eyes. Unlike many girls of her station, who were content with needlework and pianoforte, Margaret had a voracious intellect that sometimes concerned her mother. She devoured books from her father's library, histories, philosophical treatises, even medical texts considered highly improper for young ladies. She excelled in her studies, particularly in literature and French, subjects she learned from her governess, Miss Abigail Porter, a spinster from Boston who had come south seeking employment after her family's shipping business failed. Miss Porter recognized Margaret's unusual intelligence and encouraged it, sometimes to Elizabeth's dismay. She'll never find a husband if she insists on discussing Voltaire at the dinner table. Elizabeth complained to Josiah after one particularly awkward evening with the neighboring Beaumont family, whose son James was considered a prime matrimonial prospect. Josiah, however, took pride in his daughter's sharp mind. "She'll marry when and whom she chooses," he replied. "I'd rather have a daughter with thoughts in her head than one who can only simper and pour tea." In the weeks leading up to her birthday, Margaret had been unusually withdrawn, spending long hours alone in her bedroom or walking in the gardens, particularly near the old oak tree. The change in her demeanor was noted by many in the household, from her siblings to the enslaved people who attended to the family's needs. Thomas, home from his studies at the University of Alabama, expressed concern to their father that Margaret seemed somehow diminished, as if a part of her were already gone. According to the journal of Miss Porter, discovered decades later in the attic of a distant relative, Margaret had confided in her governess about the cause of her distress. The leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age, but the ink still legible, contained detailed accounts of conversations between teacher and pupil during those fateful weeks. "Margaret confided in me today about her dreams," Miss Porter wrote on June 12, 1845. She speaks of a woman with hollow eyes who calls her by name. The figure appears to her nightly, always standing beneath the old oak tree at the eastern boundary of the property. Margaret describes her as wearing a white dress of a fashion from another era, her hair loose about her shoulders in a manner no respectable woman would wear in public. The woman never speaks, yet Margaret insists she can hear her voice in her mind, calling her daughter and promising to bring her home. I assured her it was merely the result of reading too many Gothic novels before bedtime, but there is a haunted quality to her gaze that troubles me deeply. A week later, on June 19th, Miss Porter made another entry. Margaret's dreams have worsened. She now speaks of multiple women, all in white, all with the same hollow-eyed gaze. They sing to her, she says, a melody without words that stays with her upon waking. She hummed it for me today, a tonal sequence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I suggested that perhaps she should speak with her mother about these dreams, but Margaret became agitated at the suggestion. "Mother already knows," she said, in a voice so cold it scarcely sounded like her own. She's always known they would come for me." Miss Porter apparently took her concerns to Josiah, who dismissed them as the overwrought imagination of a girl approaching womanhood. Mr. Ellison suggested that perhaps Margaret needs more fresh air and exercise, less time with her books. She wrote on June 25th, "He has instructed me to focus our lessons on practical matters such as household management rather than literature or philosophy." When I attempted to explain the disturbing nature of Margaret's dreams, he cut me off, saying, "Miss Porter, I implore you to educate my daughter, not to interpret her nightmares. I fear there is more happening in this house than anyone is willing to acknowledge." On the morning of Margaret's birthday, July 15, 1845, the household was abuzz with preparations for the celebration to be held that evening. Dawn broke clear and warm, promising a perfect summer day. The Ellison plantation was a flurry of activity, as enslaved people moved about the house and grounds, carrying out Elizabeth's detailed instructions for what was to be the social event of the season. In the kitchen, Ruth supervised the preparation of Margaret's favorite dishes: roast duck with orange glaze, sweet potato soufflé, fresh corn pudding, and a three-tiered cake adorned with crystallized violets that had taken the assistant cook, a young woman named Lucinda, 2 days to perfect. In the ballroom, crystal chandeliers were being cleaned and fitted with fresh beeswax candles, their light to be supplemented by silver candelabras, positioned strategically around the perimeter of the room. Garlands of fresh flowers, magnolia, roses, and jasmine from the gardens, were draped along the staircase and wound around the columns of the front portico. The pianoforte had been tuned the day before by a specialist brought in from Mobile, and a string quartet from the same city was expected to arrive by mid-afternoon. Thomas had risen early to oversee the erection of a dance pavilion on the lawn, where younger guests could enjoy the evening air while their elders socialized inside. Josephine and Catherine, excited to wear their new dresses of pale pink and lavender silk respectively, practiced their dancing in the morning room, under the watchful eye of their mother, who corrected their posture and the placement of their hands with gentle but firm instruction. Enslaved people moved about the house, arranging flowers and preparing the feast under Elizabeth's watchful eye. Despite the celebration to come, she seemed distracted, her gaze often drifting toward the window that offered a view of the old oak tree in the distance. Twice she was heard muttering to herself, though, when addressed directly, she would compose her features into a serene smile and continue with her instructions, as if nothing were amiss. Josiah had commissioned a portrait of his daughter as a gift, and the painter, a Frenchman named Henry Beaumont, who had recently established a studio in Mobile, was expected to arrive the following week. Josiah spent the morning in his study, reviewing the final guest list with his overseer and ensuring that sufficient accommodations had been prepared for those traveling from a distance who would stay overnight. 57 guests had confirmed their attendance, including the governor's secretary and his wife, a connection that Josiah hoped might lead to political appointments in the future. Margaret herself had spent the early hours of the morning in her room, seated at her writing desk, composing letters to friends from her finishing school days who had been unable to travel for the celebration. She wore a simple morning dress of pale blue muslin, her hair braided and pinned up in preparation for the more elaborate styling that would happen later. According to her lady's maid, a young enslaved woman named Delia, Margaret had seemed calm but distant, responding to questions with one-word answers and staring for long periods at her own reflection in the mirror. Margaret spent the morning receiving gifts from her family members: a leather-bound journal with her initials, embossed in gold from her mother, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of her parents from her brother, a collection of Shakespeare sonnets, bound in Moroccan leather from her sisters, and a volume of poetry from her governess. Each gift was received with polite thanks, though those closest to her noted that the spark of pleasure that would normally light her eyes upon receiving such treasures was noticeably absent. At midday, as the July sun reached its zenith, and the heat pressed down upon the plantation like a physical weight, Margaret asked permission to walk in the gardens, wanting a moment of solitude before the guests arrived. The request was unusual. Proper young ladies rarely sought to be alone, particularly on such an important day. But Elizabeth, distracted by a minor crisis involving the placement of dinner plates, agreed without much thought. She did, however, instruct one of the enslaved house workers, a woman named Bessie, who had been with the family for many years and served as Elizabeth's personal maid, to keep watch from a distance. "The sun is fierce today," Elizabeth cautioned. "Make sure she doesn't stay out long enough to spoil her complexion." Bessie, a tall, dignified woman in her 50s with graying hair, hidden beneath a white head wrap, nodded her understanding and followed Margaret at a discreet distance as the girl made her way through the formal gardens at the rear of the house. The gardens were laid out in a geometric pattern typical of the period, with gravel paths separating beds of roses, foxgloves, and hydrangeas. At the center stood a small marble fountain featuring a cherub pouring water from an urn, the splash of water on stone offering the only sound besides the occasional buzzes of insects and the distant calls of enslaved people working in the fields beyond. According to Bessie's testimony, recorded during the subsequent investigation, Margaret walked among the blooms with a purposeful stride, unusual for a young lady of her station who would typically stroll at a more leisurely pace. She paused briefly at the fountain, trailing her fingers through the water before continuing toward the eastern edge of the garden, where the cultivated landscape gave way to more natural surroundings. Beyond the last row of rose bushes lay a meadow of wildflowers, and beyond that, the dense woodland that marked the boundary of the Ellison property. The old oak tree stood at the edge of this wood, visible from the garden as a dark silhouette against the bright midday sky. Bessie watched as Margaret's pale blue dress moved among the vibrant colors of the garden, a cool contrast to the fiery reds and yellows of the summer blooms. The girl seemed to be wandering aimlessly, but Bessie, who had raised 5 children of her own before they were sold to other plantations, recognized the deliberate nature of Margaret's movements. The girl was heading toward the oak tree, though by such a circuitous route that it might not be obvious to a less observant eye. Concerned by this, Bessie moved closer, abandoning her position near the kitchen garden to follow Margaret into the welder area beyond the formal beds. The tall grass of the meadow brushed against her skirts as she walked, and she noted with disapproval that the hem of Margaret's fine dress would be soiled by the time she returned to the house. She was about to call out to remind the girl of the time and the need to prepare for her guests, when a disturbance caught her attention. A chicken, one of the prized dominiques that provided eggs for the plantation kitchen, had somehow escaped its enclosure and was pecking at the ground near the garden shed. Knowing the cook's reliance on these birds and the trouble that would ensue if it wandered off, Bessie turned away briefly to chase it back toward the barnyard. The task took only moments. The bird was cooperative, scuttling ahead of her outstretched hands back toward its proper place. But when Bessie turned back, her heart stuttered in her chest. The meadow was empty. Margaret Ellison, in her distinctive pale blue dress, was nowhere to be seen. Bessie called out, her voice carrying across the open space. but received no answer. She hurried forward, her eyes scanning the tall grass, thinking perhaps the girl had sat down to rest or to pick wild flowers. The meadow was not large, perhaps 50 yards across, before it met the woodland, and a person standing should have been clearly visible. Yet Margaret had vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. At first, no one was alarmed. When Bessie returned to the house, breathless and wide-eyed, reporting that she had lost sight of Margaret, Elizabeth merely sighed with the exasperation of a mother whose plans were being disrupted by a willful child. "She's probably gone to the spring house to cool herself," she said, adjusting a flower arrangement on the dining table. "Or perhaps to the stables. She's always had a fondness for that new mare." She dispatched a kitchen boy to check these locations, expecting the matter to be resolved quickly. As the hour grew later, and the first carriages began to appear on the long drive leading to the house, concern began to mount. Thomas and 2 enslaved men had searched the immediate grounds, the spring house, the stables, the smokehouse, and even the slave quarters, though it was unthinkable that Margaret would have gone there unaccompanied. They found no trace of her, nor had anyone seen her since she had entered the garden, with Bessie following at a distance. Josiah, initially irritated by what he perceived as a childish prank on an important day, now paced the veranda, his expression darkening with each report of another location searched without success. "She must be found before the guests arrive," he insisted, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I will not have the Beaumonts and the Calhouns greeted with a household in disarray because my daughter has chosen this day for some foolish game." But as the first guests began to arrive, and there was still no sign of the birthday girl, concern grew into panic. Elizabeth, maintaining a brittle composure as she greeted early arrivals, dispatched them to various parts of the house with vague explanations about Margaret resting before the festivities. Meanwhile, Josiah gathered the male servants and enslaved men, organizing them into search parties to comb the wider plantation grounds. The search began in earnest, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and cultivated fields of Magnolia Hill. The house and gardens were systematically examined, every room, closet, and outbuilding inspected multiple times. As twilight approached, and still no trace of Margaret had been found, Josiah made the difficult decision to inform the assembled guests that his daughter had taken ill suddenly, and the celebration would need to be postponed. The announcement was met with murmurs of sympathy and offers of assistance, which Josiah declined with as much grace as he could muster under the circumstances. As the last of the disappointed guests departed, the search expanded to the surrounding fields and woods. Enslaved people were roused from their quarters to join the effort, carrying torches and lanterns to illuminate the growing darkness. Neighboring planters, hearing of the situation through departing guests, sent their overseers and field hands to assist, a gesture of community solidarity that transcended the usual competitive relationships among the cotton aristocracy. Lanterns flickered across the plantation through the night, their light catching on the dark leaves of magnolia trees and the rippling surface of the creek that ran along the western boundary of the property. Men called Margaret's name until they were hoarse, the sound echoing back from the woods with no answering cry. Dogs were brought in, bloodhounds owned by the Crawford plantation, 5 miles east, but they showed confusion rather than purpose, circling the area where Margaret had last been seen, but unable to establish a trail leading away. By midnight, with no sign of the missing girl, and exhaustion setting in among the searchers, some began to whisper of darker possibilities. Could Margaret have been taken by runaway slaves? There had been rumors of a band hiding in the swamps 20 miles south, occasionally raiding isolated farms for supplies. But the Ellison plantation was hardly isolated, and no other disturbances had been reported that might suggest intruders. Others speculated about a secret bew, a clandestine meeting arranged for her birthday that had gone awry. But Margaret had shown no interest in the young men of the county, and her movements had been closely supervised, as was proper for a girl of her age and station. The idea that she might have planned an elopement was considered and dismissed. She had taken nothing with her, not even a shawl against the evening chill. As dawn approached on July 16th, a discovery was made that only deepened the mystery. The only clue was a single shoe, a white satin slipper with a pearl button closure, part of the new pair Elizabeth had commissioned from a shoemaker in Mobile, specifically for Margaret's birthday celebration. It was found by Samuel, Thomas's valet, who had continued searching long after others had returned to the house for a brief rest. The shoe lay on its side at the base of the old oak tree, the very one from Margaret's dreams, its pristine fabric unstained despite the dew, dampened ground beneath it. Samuel immediately called for Josiah, who arrived moments later, disheveled from the night's searching, his eyes bloodshot and his normally impeccable attire wrinkled and stained with sweat. When he saw the slipper, he fell to his knees beside it, reaching out with trembling hands, but stopping just short of touching it, as if afraid it might dissolve into mist at his touch. "This is hers," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is what she was to wear tonight. But where is the other? Where is my daughter?" A thorough examination of the area revealed nothing more. The ground around the tree was undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. The grass stood upright, showing no signs of having been trampled by multiple feet, as would be expected had Margaret been carried off against her will. The bark of the oak tree bore no marks of climbing, no scrapes or broken branches that might suggest she had somehow ascended into its massive canopy. The single white slipper sat alone, a solitary testament to Margaret's presence and subsequent vanishing. Most disturbing to those gathered was the condition of the shoe itself. It was completely dry despite the heavy dew that had fallen overnight, soaking the grass and leaving every other object in the vicinity slick with moisture. When Josiah finally picked it up, handling it as reverently as a holy relic, he noted that it was warm to the touch, as if it had just been removed from a living foot, though it had clearly been there for hours. "This isn't natural," whispered one of the enslaved women, only to be silenced by a sharp look from the overseer. But her words gave voice to what many were thinking. There was something uncanny about the lone slipper, something that suggested forces beyond their understanding. In the days that followed, Josiah Ellison spared no expense in the search for his eldest daughter. He hired private investigators from Mobile and Montgomery, offering substantial rewards for information, leading to Margaret's whereabouts. Notices were placed in newspapers throughout Alabama and neighboring states, describing the missing girl and the circumstances of her disappearance. Strangers arriving in the county were viewed with suspicion and questioned closely by local authorities at Josiah's insistence. As July turned to August with no sign of Margaret, Josiah's methods grew increasingly desperate. He consulted with a Cherokee tracker who had a reputation for finding those who did not wish to be found, paying the man an exorbitant sum to examine the area around the oak tree. The tracker spent a day in silent contemplation of the site, but at sunset he returned the gold coins Josiah had given him, saying simply, "This is not a matter for my skills. Your daughter walks paths I cannot follow." By September, With hope fading and conventional methods exhausted, Josiah turned to less orthodox approaches. Despite his position as a church vestryman and his previous disdain for what he termed heathen superstitions, he now sought out those who claimed connections to the unseen world. A conjure woman from the swamps, known only as Mother Surreal, was brought to the plantation under cover of darkness. She performed rituals involving herbs and bones, muttering incantations in a mixture of French and African dialects, but could offer no concrete information about Margaret's fate, only cryptic warnings about women who wait beyond the veil. In October, at Elizabeth's insistence, Josiah consulted a spiritualist from New Orleans, a Creole woman known only as Madame Laveau, reputed to have the power to communicate with the dead. The seance, conducted in the formal parlor of Magnolia Hill, with only the immediate family present, ended abruptly when the medium began to speak in a voice not her own, a high, childlike tone that Elizabeth identified with a gasp as Margaret's. "The women in white have welcomed me home," the voice said through Madame Laveau's lips. "Do not seek what is freely given." Then the medium collapsed, and upon reviving, claimed to have no memory of what had transpired. The local newspaper, the Southern Sentinel, carried weekly updates on the search, but as summer turned to autumn, hope began to fade. The articles grew shorter, relegated to inside pages rather than the front page coverage of the early weeks. By Christmas, mentions of the Ellison case had dwindled to occasional paragraphs noting the lack of progress, often accompanied by reminders of the standing reward for information. Elizabeth Ellison took to her bed, consumed by grief. Thomas, at 17, shouldered the responsibility of managing the plantation, while his father devoted himself to finding Margaret. The younger daughters were kept under constant supervision, never allowed to wander alone, even within the house. The oak tree, once a distinctive landmark on the property, became an object of fear. Enslaved people refused to work near it, crossing themselves or making other protective gestures when forced to pass it. Josiah considered having it cut down, but couldn't bring himself to give the order, haunted by the irrational fear that doing so might somehow sever his last connection to his missing daughter. Miss Porter's journal entries from this period reveal the atmosphere of dread that had settled over the Ellison household. There is a terrible silence in the house now, where once there was music and laughter. Now there are only whispers and furtive glances. Mrs. Ellison wakes screaming in the night, claiming to have seen Margaret standing at the foot of her bed, her clothes soaked as if she had been caught in a downpour. The other children are afraid, though they try to hide it. Little Catherine asked me yesterday if she too would disappear when she turned 16. I did not know how to answer her. Life on the plantation eventually settled into a new rhythm, one punctuated by Josiah's increasingly desperate attempts to find his daughter. He traveled as far as New York and Boston, following rumors and supposed sightings, always returning empty-handed and a little more hollow-eyed. The once ambitious planter now moved like a man 20 years older, his shoulders stooped, his eyes constantly searching the horizon as if expecting Margaret to materialize in the distance. By the summer of 1847, the search had been all but abandoned. The Ellisons held a memorial service for Margaret, though Elizabeth insisted that a place still be set for her at the dinner table each night. She might come home hungry, she would say, her voice distant, her eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. And then, as July approached once more, the household was forced to confront a terrible reality. Catherine, Ellison's 16th birthday, was drawing near. Catherine had always been the practical one, less dreamy than Margaret, more interested in the running of the household than in books or music. She had her mother's blonde hair, but her father's steady gaze, and a no-nonsense approach to life that had become more pronounced since her sister's disappearance. In the 2 years since Margaret had vanished, Catherine had matured quickly, helping her mother manage the domestic affairs of the plantation and caring for her younger siblings. She had taken over many of the duties that would normally have fallen to Elizabeth, who remained fragile and often confined to her bed with mysterious ailments that the family physician could neither diagnose nor treat. As her birthday approached, Catherine showed no signs of the dreams that had troubled Margaret. She maintained a brisk efficiency in her daily tasks, supervising the enslaved houseworkers with a competence that belied her young age. When Miss Porter tentatively inquired about her sleep, Catherine replied simply, "I sleep soundly, thank you. I have no time for nightmares. I don't put stock in coincidences or curses," she told Miss Porter, according to the governess's journal. Margaret's disappearance was a tragedy, but it won't happen to me. Father has hired extra men to watch the property, and I have no intention of wandering off alone. Josiah Ellison had indeed taken precautions. Armed men patrolled the boundaries of the plantation day and night. The old oak tree had been cut down and its wood burned, despite the protests of some of the older enslaved people who warned that disturbing the tree would only bring more misfortune. Catherine was never left alone. A companion slept in her room at night, and she was accompanied everywhere during the day. On the morning of Catherine's birthday, October 3, 1847, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Elizabeth had not left her bed in days, overwhelmed by memories of Margaret's disappearance. Josiah moved about the house like a man in a trance, checking and rechecking that the guards were at their posts. Catherine herself remained composed, though Miss Porter noted a certain resignation in her manner, as if she were preparing herself for an inevitability she dared not name. The day passed without incident. Catherine received her gifts, shared a small cake with her family, and retired early, exhausted by the constant scrutiny and the weight of unspoken fears. It was just before dawn when the screams began. The companion who shared Catherine's room, a cousin named Harriet, who had come to stay with the family after Margaret's disappearance, awoke to find Catherine's bed empty. She immediately raised the alarm, and within minutes, the household was in chaos. Catherine's nightgown was found laid out neatly on her bed, as if she had simply stepped out of it. The window was closed and latched from the inside. The door had been locked, the key still in the keyhole on the inside of the room. And yet, Catherine Ellison was gone. The search was immediate and frantic. The guards swore that no one had approached the house during the night, and no one had left. The bloodhounds picked up no scent trail beyond Catherine's room. It was impossible. A repeat of Margaret's vanishing, only this time from within a locked room in a house, surrounded by watchful eyes. The second disappearance broke something in Josiah Ellison. He no longer spoke of finding his daughters, but instead became obsessed with protecting those who remained. Josephine, now 14, and Sarah, just 3, were moved into the master bedroom, where both parents could watch over them day and night. The plantation began to decline. Josiah neglected the fields in favor of building ever more elaborate security measures around the house. Iron bars were installed on all windows. Additional locks were added to each door. No one was permitted to enter or leave without Josiah's explicit permission. Elizabeth, meanwhile, retreated further into her own world. She began to speak to her missing daughters, as if they were in the room with her, setting places for them at meals, folding their laundry, arranging flowers in their empty bedrooms. The enslaved people whispered among themselves, saying that the land itself had turned against the Ellisons, that they had built their home on ground that didn't want them there. Some spoke of an old burial ground that had been plowed under when the plantation was first established, of spirits disturbed and seeking vengeance. Others blamed Madame Lavo, suggesting that her attempts to contact Margaret had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Miss Porter's journal from this period grows increasingly disturbed. I fear for my sanity in this house. Last night, I dreamt I saw Catherine walking across the cotton fields, her white nightgown billowing though there was no wind. When she turned to look at me, her face was that of an old woman, her eyes dark pits in a withered face. Behind her walked Margaret, and behind Margaret a procession of women I did not recognize. All in white, all with the same hollow-eyed gaze. They were singing something, a melody I could not quite grasp, but which filled me with such dread that I woke screaming. Mrs. Ellison merely looked at me and said, "You've seen them too then. God help us all." By 1849, the once prosperous Ellison plantation was in shambles. Many of the enslaved people had been sold to pay debts, as the cotton crop had failed 2 years in a row. The remaining house servants whispered that the land was cursed, that nothing would grow until the Ellisons were gone. And still, inexorably, time moved forward, bringing Josephine's 16th birthday ever closer. Josephine had been 12 when Margaret disappeared, 14 when Catherine followed. Now, as April 1849 approached, she was a solemn young woman who rarely smiled and never ventured beyond the confines of the house. Unlike her sisters, she seemed to anticipate her fate with a kind of grim resignation. "Josephine came to me last night," Miss Porter wrote in February 1849. "She asked if I would take Sarah away before April comes. 'They won't stop with me,' she said. 'They'll take Sarah too, when her time comes. But you can save her, Miss Porter. Take her north. Change her name. Never speak of the Ellisons again.' When I asked who they were, she looked at me as if I were simple and said, 'The women in white, of course. The ones who were here before us, the ones we displaced.' I promised I would consider it, though, in truth, I do not believe Mr. Ellison would ever let his youngest child out of his sight, let alone into my sole care." As April approached, Josiah Ellison's preparations took on an almost manic quality. He dismissed the remaining house servants, unwilling to trust anyone outside the family. He boarded up every entrance to the house save one, which he guarded himself, rifle in hand. He consulted engineers about the possibility of building an underground chamber, where Josephine could be kept safe. But by then his funds were too depleted to undertake such a project. Elizabeth, in a rare moment of lucidity, suggested they leave the plantation entirely. "We'll go north," she proposed at the dinner table one night in March. "We'll change our names, start anew where this shadow cannot follow us." But Josiah refused. "This is our home," he insisted. "I built it from nothing. I won't be driven away by whatever this is. We'll stand our ground. We'll break this curse." As the fateful day approached, Josephine grew increasingly withdrawn. She spent hours staring out the barred windows, her expression unreadable. Sometimes she could be heard humming a strange, atonal melody that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. On the eve of her birthday, April 22, 1849, Josephine asked to speak with her father alone. What transpired during that conversation was never